June 14, 1943. Wheeled Vehicle Experimental Establishment, Farnborough, England. Major Ronald Pemberton's leather gloves gripped the steering wheel of the American Dodge WC54 ambulance as it climbed a muddy test slope that had defeated every British vehicle that morning. This shouldn't be possible, not with a fully loaded ambulance. The WC54's four-wheel drive system engaged seamlessly, distributing power to all wheels with a precision Pemberton had never experienced in 2 decades of military vehicle testing. Behind him, 3 test engineers clutched their clipboards as the ambulance ascended the 35-degree incline without wheel spin, without hesitation, carrying a simulated patient load of 800 pounds. The Austin K2, Britain's standard ambulance, 13,102 units already produced, sat at the bottom of the hill, mud-caked on its rear-wheel drive axles, unable to attempt even half the gradient. The test that morning was supposed to validate British engineering superiority. Instead, it revealed an uncomfortable truth that would ripple through the Royal Army Medical Corps within weeks. Britain had invented the modern ambulance service during the Napoleonic Wars. British engineers had pioneered military vehicle design through 2 decades of colonial operations across every terrain imaginable: desert sand in Egypt, mountain tracks in Afghanistan, jungle mud in Burma. The Austin K2 represented the culmination of that experience. Purpose-built for battlefield casualty evacuation with 50 miles per hour top speed and proven reliability across North Africa and Italy. Yet here was an American vehicle, designed by engineers who'd never seen combat, built in factories that had been making civilian cars just 2 years earlier, outperforming Britain's best effort in every measurable category. The implications were as humbling as they were undeniable. The journey to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, when Britain entered the war desperately short of military vehicles of every type. In September 1939, the British Army possessed fewer than 50,000 motor vehicles total, many of them antiquated designs from the previous decade. The Austin Motor Company received urgent War Office contracts to produce a standardized ambulance built on the K2 chassis, a 2-ton truck platform that Austin had been manufacturing since 1939. The first Austin K2Y ambulances rolled off production lines at Longbridge, Birmingham, in March 1940, just as the phony war collapsed into the chaos of Blitzkrieg. The Austin K2 ambulance measured 17 feet 6 inches long with a wheelbase of 11 feet 6 inches. Its 3.5-liter 6-cylinder petrol engine produced 60 horsepower, adequate for moving the vehicle's 3.5-ton laden weight at speeds up to 50 miles per hour on paved roads. The cargo compartment could accommodate 4 stretcher patients or 10 sitting wounded, with a medical orderly seat positioned near the rear doors. Large red crosses painted on white circles marked the roof and sides, identifying it as protected under the Geneva Conventions. British military planners considered the design thoroughly adequate. The K2 possessed good road speed, reasonable fuel economy at 18 miles per gallon, and sufficient cargo capacity. Its rear-wheel drive configuration was conventional, proven, and familiar to British military drivers. Austin's factories could produce them in quantity, eventually reaching 13,102 units by war's end across multiple variants, including the K2/Y ambulance, K3/Y heavy ambulance, and specialized surgical unit versions. The Austin K2 first saw combat service during the North African Campaign in late 1940. Medical units of the 7th Armored Division operated dozens of K2 ambulances across the western desert, evacuating casualties from forward aid stations to field hospitals 20 to 30 miles behind the front lines. On paved roads and hard-packed desert tracks, the Austin performed its mission adequately. Drivers praised its mechanical reliability, the engine rarely failed, and spare parts were readily available from supply dumps. But the western desert also revealed the K2's fundamental limitation. During the confused mobile warfare of Operation Crusader in November 1941, British forces fought across 200 miles of Libyan desert, much of it soft sand or broken terrain churned by tank tracks. Medical units repeatedly found their Austin K2 ambulances unable to reach forward positions where casualties waited. The two-wheel drive configuration meant that when one rear wheel lost traction in sand or mud, the vehicle stopped moving. Drivers developed techniques, carrying sand channels, letting air from tires to increase surface area, but physics remained unforgiving. Royal Army Medical Corps officers filed reports noting these difficulties, but no alternatives existed. Britain's automotive industry was fully committed to existing production contracts. Every factory operated at maximum capacity, building tanks, trucks, scout cars, and the 1,000 other vehicles modern mechanized warfare demanded. Redesigning the ambulance through 1941 and into 1942, British medical units across multiple theaters encountered the same fundamental problem with increasing frequency. In the Western Desert, during Rommel's counteroffensive of January 1942, the 4th Indian Division lost contact with forward casualty collection points when Austin K2 ambulances bogged down in soft sand near Ajdabiya. Wounded men waited 12 to 18 hours for evacuation, time that meant the difference between recovery and death for soldiers with traumatic injuries. Medical officers watched helplessly as their ambulances sat immobilized 400 yards from paved roads, rear wheels spinning uselessly. In Burma, during the 1942 retreat, monsoon rains transformed dirt tracks into impassable quagmires. The 17th Indian Division's medical units abandoned 8 Austin K2 ambulances near Yangongyong in April 1942 when the vehicles sank to their axles in mud that four-wheel drive Chevrolet trucks navigated successfully. Wounded men rode out on those American trucks while British ambulances were destroyed to prevent capture. In Tunisia throughout the winter of 1942-1943, the hilly terrain and primitive roads again exposed the Austin's limitations. During the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, American forces, equipped with Dodge WC54 ambulances, evacuated casualties from forward positions that British Austin K2s could not reach. British medical officers observed with professional interest and growing frustration. The pattern was unmistakable. The Austin K2 performed adequately on good roads, but failed when terrain deteriorated. Since combat inevitably destroyed roads and occurred in places where roads had never existed, this represented a critical operational limitation. Yet British medical units had no alternative. They made the Austin K2 work through ingenuity, determination, and acceptance of longer evacuation times. American medical units, by contrast, operated with a mobility advantage that British officers found remarkable. The Dodge WC54, officially designated the Truck 1/2-ton 4x4 ambulance, went anywhere its drivers pointed it. Four-wheel drive, high ground clearance, and sophisticated suspension allowed it to follow combat units across terrain that would strand a conventional two-wheel drive vehicle. British medical officers observed this capability during joint operations in North Africa. They noted it again in Sicily during July 1943, where Dodge ambulances operated effectively on mountain roads bombed into rubble, while Austin K2s required extensive pioneer work to navigate the same routes. The observations accumulated in after-action reports, eventually reaching staff officers at the War Office in London. The advantage depended entirely on mobility, specifically the mobility that four-wheel drive provided under combat conditions. And by mid-1943, but by June 1943, the tactical picture and British military thinking began to change in fundamental ways. On June 7, 1943, a single Dodge WC54 ambulance arrived at the Wheeled Vehicle Experimental Establishment in Farnborough, requisitioned through Lend-Lease channels for comparative testing. The vehicle bore U.S. Army markings and showed evidence of recent Mediterranean service, North African dust in the wheel wells, faded paintwork, 3,200 miles on the odometer. Major Ronald Pemberton, head of the WVE's ambulance testing section, received orders to conduct comprehensive trials comparing the American vehicle against the standard Austin K2. Pemberton approached the assignment with professional skepticism. British automotive engineering had been developing military vehicles since before the First World War. American manufacturers, by contrast, had been building primarily civilian automobiles until 1940. The assumption among WVE staff was that comparative testing would validate the Austin K2's adequacy and perhaps identify minor improvements worth incorporating. The testing protocol was rigorous and comprehensive. Over 6 weeks, both ambulances would face identical trials: road speed tests, fuel consumption measurements, load capacity verification, hill climbing at various gradients, cross-country mobility through mud and sand, ford depth testing, reliability assessments measuring mean time between failures, and patient comfort evaluation using instrumented mannequins to measure vibration and shock. The Dodge WC54 arrived weighing 5,780 pounds empty, nearly 1,200 pounds heavier than the Austin K2's 4,600 pounds. Pemberton's team initially viewed this as a disadvantage. The American ambulance's 92 horsepower inline-6 engine was more powerful than the Austin's 60 horsepower unit, but the power-to-weight ratio was nearly identical. On paper, the vehicles appeared roughly equivalent. The first dramatic divergence appeared during the hill climbing trials on June 14, 1943. The test course included a series of progressively steeper grades, from 15 degrees up to 40 degrees, surfaced with loose gravel and wet clay to simulate combat conditions. Both ambulances carried 800-pound loads representing 4 stretcher patients plus medical equipment. The Austin K2 managed the 15-degree and 20-degree slopes adequately, though with noticeable wheel spin. At 25 degrees, the Austin required 3 attempts, the driver carefully modulating throttle to prevent the rear wheels from breaking traction completely. At 30 degrees, the Austin K2 could not maintain forward progress. The rear wheels simply spun in the mud while the vehicle slid backward. Major Pemberton climbed behind the wheel of the Dodge WC54 expecting similar results. Instead, the American ambulance ascended the 30-degree slope on its first attempt, maintaining steady forward progress without wheel spin. At 35 degrees, a gradient the Austin hadn't even attempted, the WC54 climbed successfully, its 4-wheel drive system distributing power so effectively that Pemberton barely needed to modulate the throttle. At 40 degrees, near the physical limit of vehicle stability, the Dodge still maintained traction, though Pemberton prudently backed down after 50 feet to avoid risking a rollover. The test engineers stood in silence as Pemberton drove the WC54 back to the starting point. The cross-country mobility trials 2 days later confirmed what the hill test had revealed. Through deep mud, across soft sand, over rough terrain strewn with obstacles, conditions that forced the Austin K2 to seek alternative routes or simply stop, the Dodge WC54 proceeded with what one test driver described as almost contemptuous ease. The American ambulance's 4-wheel drive system, engaged and disengaged via a floor-mounted transfer case lever, provided traction that simply had no equivalent in the British vehicle. But the superiority ran deeper than just the drivetrain. When WVE engineers stripped both ambulances for detailed examination, they discovered engineering sophistication in the Dodge that reflected lessons Britain had simply never learned. The WC54's suspension system used longitudinal semi-elliptical springs front and rear, carefully calibrated to provide 8 inches of wheel travel, twice what the Austin K2 offered. This translated directly into patient comfort. The instrumented mannequins in the Dodge experienced 40% less vibration over rough roads than those in the Austin. The American ambulance's heating system, critical for patient care in European winters, consisted of a ducted hot air system that actually worked, maintaining cargo compartment temperature 15 degrees higher than the Austin's inadequate single-vent heater. The driver's compartment featured better visibility, more intuitive control layout, and a seat that multiple test drivers described as remarkably comfortable for a military vehicle. Weight distribution revealed another advantage. The Dodge's transfer case and front differential added complexity and weight, but American engineers had positioned these components to achieve near-perfect 50-50 weight balance front to rear. The Austin K2, with its engine mounted forward and no front drive components, carried 58% of its weight on the front axle when unloaded, a configuration that reduced rear-wheel traction precisely when the vehicle needed it most. The comparative analysis section of Pemberton's report laid out the mathematics with clinical precision. The Austin K2 cost 485 pounds to manufacture, weighed 4,600 pounds empty, produced 60 horsepower, achieved 18 miles per gallon, and could ford 24 inches of water. Maximum gradient on loose surface, 25 degrees. Cross-country speed, 8 to 12 miles per hour on suitable terrain, frequently 0 on difficult terrain. The Dodge WC54 cost approximately 520 pounds in Lend-Lease accounting, weighed 5,780 pounds empty, produced 92 horsepower, achieved 14 miles per gallon, and could ford 32 inches of water. Maximum gradient on loose surface, 38 degrees. Cross-country speed, 12 to 18 miles per hour on virtually any terrain a combat unit could traverse. The fuel economy disadvantage, 4 miles per gallon, translated to approximately 15 gallons more fuel consumed per 100 miles of operation. The weight penalty was 1,180 pounds, most of it in the four-wheel drive components. These were not trivial costs. But against these costs stood a simple operational reality. The Dodge WC54 could go places and do things the Austin K2 fundamentally could not. In military terms, it possessed a qualitative advantage that transcended quantitative measures. An ambulance that reached casualties saved lives. An ambulance that bogged down 400 yards short saved nothing. Major Pemberton's final report to the War Office, submitted July 28, 1943, concluded with a recommendation that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Britain should immediately request Dodge WC54 ambulances through Lend-Lease to supplement and eventually replace the Austin K2 in frontline service. The requirements that created the Dodge WC54 had been issued by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps in November 1940, when America still remained technically neutral but was rapidly mobilizing. American military planners, observing the collapse of France and the Battle of Britain, recognized that modern mechanized warfare demanded vehicles with capabilities beyond what peacetime civilian designs provided. The Quartermaster Corps issued specifications for a new family of half-ton and three-quarter-ton trucks, all to be built with four-wheel drive, high ground clearance, and the ability to traverse terrain that would stop conventional vehicles. The specifications were exact and demanding. The ambulance variant required four-wheel drive with selectable engagement, minimum 8 inches ground clearance under axles, 32-inch water fording capability, ability to climb 60% gradient, 31 degrees, on hard surface, cargo capacity for 4 litters or 8 ambulatory patients, top speed minimum 50 miles per hour on road, minimum 250-mile range, maximum weight 6,000 pounds laden, production cost not to exceed $1,850 per unit. Into this exacting requirement stepped the Dodge division of Chrysler Corporation, which had been building military trucks since the 1930s. The design team was led by Chief Engineer Henry D. Weaver, a 28-year veteran of Chrysler who had overseen development of the company's commercial truck line through the Depression. Weaver understood that meeting the Army's specifications required abandoning conventional civilian automotive architecture. Four-wheel drive meant adding a transfer case, front differential, front axle shafts, and front universal joints, components that added weight, complexity, and cost, but were non-negotiable requirements. The mathematics were brutally simple and mirrored exactly the trade-offs facing every military vehicle designer in 1940. A conventional rear-wheel drive truck chassis weighed approximately 2,800 pounds. Adding four-wheel drive components added 780 pounds. Transfer case, 180 pounds. Front differential, 240 pounds. Front drive shafts and joints, 160 pounds. Reinforced front axle beam, 200 pounds. The ambulance body added 1,200 pounds. Engine, transmission, and running gear added another 1,800 pounds. Total, 6,580 pounds empty, 7,580 pounds loaded with 4 patients and equipment. The Army specification demanded maximum 6,000 pounds laden weight. Weaver's team had to remove 1,580 pounds from somewhere. They couldn't reduce the four-wheel drive system weight. Those components were load-bearing and already engineered to minimum practical mass. They couldn't reduce the engine weight substantially. Power requirements dictated displacement. The transmission, brakes, and running gear were similarly constrained by engineering realities. The decision came down to construction philosophy and material selection. Instead of using heavy steel pressings for body panels, Dodge engineers specified thinner gauge steel with strategic reinforcement. Instead of a heavy wooden cargo floor, they used lighter aluminum diamond plate. Instead of elaborate interior finishing, they created Spartan but functional spaces. The driver's compartment received a simple painted steel dashboard instead of the civilian model's chrome-trimmed instrument panel. Seats used minimal padding, just enough for function. But, and this distinction proved critical, Dodge engineers never compromised structural integrity or mechanical reliability. The frame rails remained heavy-gauge steel. Suspension components were robustly engineered. The engine was Dodge's proven 230 cubic inch inline-six, a design that had accumulated millions of civilian miles proving its durability. When weight had to be removed, it came from non-essential comfort and aesthetic features, not from core mechanical systems. This reflected a design philosophy born from American civilian automotive competition. In peacetime America, automotive manufacturers competed ruthlessly for consumer preference. Reliability, comfort, and features sold cars. A manufacturer that built vehicles prone to breakdown lost market share rapidly. This environment had forced American automotive engineers to develop remarkably sophisticated mechanical components: synchromesh transmissions, hydraulic brakes, independent front suspension, effective heating systems, and to build them with a reliability that mass-market civilian use demanded. British military vehicle design had evolved from different pressures. Designed primarily for colonial operations where maintenance support was assumed available and where mechanical simplicity was valued over sophistication, British military trucks prioritized ease of repair over ultimate reliability. The assumption was that when a military vehicle broke, military mechanics would fix it. This was not an unreasonable assumption given the British Army's extensive service infrastructure. But it led to different engineering choices. When Dodge engineers faced the choice between a simple heating system that barely worked and a complex ducted system that worked well, they chose the latter because civilian customers demanded effective heating. When British engineers faced the same choice, they chose the former because military specifications emphasized simplicity. The result was that by 1943, American automotive engineering, despite far less military vehicle experience than Britain, had accidentally created designs better suited to actual combat conditions. Detroit's ruthless civilian market had forced innovations that Woolwich Arsenal and Austin Motor Company had never needed to develop. The Dodge WC54 was not designed to be superior to the Austin K2. The engineers who created it had never heard of the Austin K2. They simply built to their specifications, using engineering approaches that American commercial competition had validated, and the result happened to surpass British capabilities across almost every measurable parameter. The irony was perfect and humbling. America's competitive capitalist automotive industry had created better military vehicles than Britain's coordinated military-industrial establishment precisely because civilian American consumers were more demanding than British military procurement officers. The immediate consequence of the Farnborough testing was bureaucratic and swift. On August 4, 1943, the War Office submitted formal request through Lend-Lease administration for 2,000 Dodge WC54 ambulances, with priority shipping requested for the first 500 units. The request specified that vehicles should be delivered with right-hand drive where possible, British electrical systems for compatibility with existing military equipment, and metric speedometers. American production facilities agreed to provide vehicles with left-hand drive and U.S. specifications. Britain would convert them as needed. The first shipment of 64 Dodge WC54 ambulances arrived at Liverpool aboard the Liberty ship SS John W. Brown on September 18, 1943. Royal Army Medical Corps personnel took delivery immediately, assigned the vehicles to units training for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France, and began driver familiarization. British drivers, accustomed to the Austin K2's straightforward controls, needed instruction in operating the WC54's transfer case and four-wheel drive system. Training reports from late 1943 recorded unanimous enthusiasm. Sergeant Thomas Wexford, a medical orderly with the 50th Northumbrian Division, wrote in his diary, "Drove the new American ambulance today. It's like comparing a motor car to a lorry. Goes anywhere without hesitation. The wounded will ride much more comfortably in these." Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Stephenson, Deputy Assistant Director of Medical Services for 2nd Corps, submitted an assessment in November 1943, noting, "The Dodge ambulance represents a substantial improvement in mobility and patient comfort over our current Austin vehicles. Recommend maximum possible allocation for forward medical units where cross-country performance is essential." By December 1943, British forces had received 420 Dodge WC54 ambulances. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, the number had grown to 1,847 units. They went ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches in Normandy as integral components of British medical evacuation chains. The Normandy campaign immediately validated the WC54's capabilities and exposed the Austin K2's limitations one final time. Northern France in June 1944 presented ambulance drivers with the worst possible conditions. Allied aerial bombardment and naval gunfire had pulverized roads into rubble. Fields churned by tank tracks became mud pits. Hedgerow country featured sunken lanes barely wide enough for single vehicles, with surfaces destroyed by military traffic. Into this landscape went medical units equipped with both Austin K2s and Dodge WC54s, and the performance differential was stark. On June 12, 1944, the 3rd British Infantry Division's main dressing station operated near Cambez-on-Plain, 3 miles inland from Sword Beach. Casualty collection points lay scattered across fields and villages up to 5 miles forward. Medical convoys ran continuously, evacuating wounded from forward aid posts to the dressing station, then onward to beach clearing stations for transport to England. The Austin K2 ambulances managed the journey to forward positions only when engineers had corduroyed the routes, laying logs or metal trackway across mud to provide stable surface. Without this preparation, the Austin vehicles bogged down repeatedly. Medical officers reported average evacuation times of 45 to 60 minutes for the 5-mile journey forward, with frequent delays when ambulances required towing from soft ground. The Dodge WC54 ambulances simply drove cross-country on whatever route was most direct. Average evacuation time, 20 to 25 minutes for the same 5 miles. No engineering support required. No delays for recovery. The four-wheel drive system that British engineers had evaluated so thoroughly at Farnborough proved its worth in conditions where minutes determined survival. Lieutenant James Hartley, medical officer with the 2nd Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles, wrote in a letter home dated June 18, 1944, "The American ambulances are extraordinary machines. Yesterday we had a man with severe chest wounds who needed immediate surgery. The Austin would have taken 40 minutes to reach him through the mud. He'd have died. The Dodge made it in 15 minutes. He'll live. That's what these vehicles mean." Similar reports accumulated throughout the Normandy campaign. During Operation Epsom, June 26 to 30, 1944, British forces suffered approximately 4,000 casualties in fighting around Caen. Medical units equipped with Dodge ambulances evacuated wounded at rates 40 to 50% faster than units still dependent on Austin K2s. This translated directly into survival rates, though exact statistics are impossible to extract from incomplete wartime medical records. The pattern continued through the advance across France and into the Low Countries. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, British airborne forces at Arnhem relied entirely on airdropped medical supplies and personnel. Evacuation to ground-based hospitals required vehicles capable of navigating Dutch polder country, flat land crisscrossed by drainage ditches and canals, with soft soil that was impassable after rain. The Austin K2 ambulances supporting 33rd Corps bogged down repeatedly on approach routes. WC54s, assigned to the Guards Armored Division, maintained evacuation schedules even after heavy rain on September 20 turned unpaved roads into quagmires. Technical modifications attempted to improve the Austin K2's performance came too late and accomplished too little. In October 1944, Austin engineers developed a modified rear axle with limited slip differential intended to reduce wheel spin by transferring power to whichever rear wheel had better traction. Testing at WVE showed modest improvement, perhaps 10% better performance in mud and sand. But the fundamental limitation remained. Two-wheel drive could not match four-wheel drive on soft terrain. Only 280 Austin K2 ambulances received the modified axle before production ended in November 1944. By early 1945, British medical units had received 3,640 Dodge WC54 ambulances through Lend-Lease. The Royal Army Medical Corps assigned them preferentially to forward units, field ambulances, light field ambulances, and casualty clearing stations, where mobility was most critical. Austin K2 ambulances remained in service with rear area units, base hospitals, and static medical facilities where their limitations mattered less. The Free French forces also received Dodge WC54 ambulances, approximately 800 units allocated through combined British-American Lend-Lease arrangements. French medical officers, like their British counterparts, praised the vehicle's cross-country performance. Colonel Henry Mondesir, chief medical officer of the French 2nd Armored Division, noted in his post-war memoir, "The American ambulance was far superior to any vehicle we had previously used. It represented the best of American industrial capability." The Austin K2 continued serving adequately in roles where its limitations didn't matter. On paved roads in England, transporting patients between hospitals, it performed its mission satisfactorily. In rear areas with good roads, it remained useful. But in frontline service, where terrain was contested and roads were destroyed, the Austin K2 had been surpassed by an American design that British engineers, with their decades of experience, simply hadn't matched. One final incident crystallized the difference with brutal clarity. On March 24, 1945, during Operation Varsity, the airborne assault across the Rhine, British 6th Airborne Division medical units operated on both banks of the river. The eastern bank featured agricultural land torn by combat, with roads reduced to rubble by artillery fire. An Austin K2 ambulance attempting to reach a forward aid post near the village of Hemmenkiln became hopelessly mired in mud 800 yards from the position. The crew walked to the aid post, found 6 seriously wounded paratroopers awaiting evacuation, and radioed for a vehicle capable of reaching them. A Dodge WC54 from the 224th Parachute Field Ambulance drove cross-country to the position, loaded the casualties, and returned to the river crossing in 35 minutes. All 6 wounded men survived and eventually returned to duty. The Austin K2 remained stuck until engineers brought a recovery vehicle the next morning. Final production statistics told the story in numbers that required no interpretation. Austin Motor Company manufactured 13,102 K2Y ambulances between March 1940 and November 1944, when production ceased. These vehicles served across every theater where British forces fought: Western Desert, East Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, Burma, and in garrison duties throughout the empire. The K2 variants included the standard 4-liter ambulance, heavy ambulances capable of carrying 6 liters, and specialized surgical unit vehicles equipped with operating tables and sterilization equipment. The United States manufactured 23,691 Dodge WC54 ambulances between January 1942 and August 1945, part of the larger W series that totaled over 250,000 vehicles across all variants. Britain received 3,640 WC4s through Lend-Lease by war's end. Free French forces received approximately 800 units. The Soviet Union received 2,170 units. The remaining vehicles served with U.S. forces across all theaters. Loss rates and survival statistics for ambulances are difficult to establish with precision. Medical vehicles generally operated behind front lines and suffered lower combat loss rates than fighting vehicles. Available records suggest that approximately 8% of Austin K2 ambulances were lost to enemy action, accidents, or mechanical failure beyond repair. Roughly 12,000 K2 ambulances survived to 1945. The higher loss rate for Dodge WC54s, approximately 11%, reflected their employment further forward where combat risk was greater. American medical units operated by doctrine, with ambulances moving as close to forward aid stations as possible, accepting increased vehicle risk to minimize casualty evacuation time. What statistics cannot capture is the lived experience of drivers and medical personnel who used both vehicles. Sergeant Donald McPherson, Royal Army Medical Corps, drove both Austin K2s and Dodge WC54s during the Northwest Europe campaign. In a 1946 interview, he stated, "The Austin was reliable enough, but it couldn't go many places where casualties needed collecting. The Dodge went anywhere. If I had to pick one vehicle to get wounded men out under difficult conditions, I'd take the Dodge every time without hesitation." The comparative analysis between British and American ambulance design philosophy revealed differences that transcended mere engineering specifications. The Austin K2 represented British military vehicle doctrine refined through decades of colonial warfare. Emphasis on mechanical simplicity, ease of field repair, adequate performance for most conditions, and cost control. The design assumed that when terrain became impassable, engineers would improve it or routes would be adjusted. This was a rational assumption in colonial operations where time pressure was often minimal and where British forces could control logistics. The Dodge WC54 represented American automotive philosophy adapted to military requirements. Emphasis on absolute reliability, sophisticated engineering for superior performance, capability to operate independently of infrastructure, and acceptance of complexity if it delivered operational advantage. The design assumed that combat conditions would be terrible and that vehicles needed to perform regardless of terrain or support availability. Both philosophies possessed internal logic, but by 1943, the American approach had proven more effective for the conditions of modern mechanized warfare in Europe. The weight penalty that four-wheel drive imposed, 1,180 pounds of additional components, cost approximately 30% more fuel consumption and reduced payload by the equivalent of 1 liter patient. American designers accepted these penalties as necessary costs for the mobility advantage that four-wheel drive provided. British designers, constrained by fuel scarcity and attempting to maximize payload efficiency, had chosen rear-wheel drive to minimize weight and fuel consumption. This was a reasonable engineering decision in 1939, before combat experience revealed how often poor terrain made conventional ambulances ineffective. The philosophical difference ultimately came down to a single question: what matters most in an ambulance, efficiency or effectiveness? The Austin K2 was more efficient, consuming less fuel per mile and carrying slightly more payload per pound of vehicle weight. The Dodge WC54 was more effective, reaching casualties the Austin couldn't reach and evacuating them faster under combat conditions. In total war, effectiveness trumped efficiency. The examination at Farnborough in June 1943 had provided definitive proof of a truth that British medical officers already suspected from field experience: America had built a better ambulance. This admission came at a cost to British pride. Britain had pioneered military ambulance services, had operated them longer than any other nation, and possessed experienced engineers who understood battlefield requirements intimately. Yet when objective testing compared British and American designs, the American vehicle proved superior in virtually every measurable category. What made the result remarkable was Britain's response. Rather than defend existing procurement decisions, rather than rationalize the Austin K2's limitations, rather than let national pride override operational necessity, British military leadership made the pragmatic choice. They adopted the superior American design immediately and allocated it to units where its advantages mattered most. This represented reverse Lend-Lease in its purest form. Not just America supplying Britain with equipment Britain couldn't manufacture in sufficient quantity, but America supplying Britain with equipment superior to what British industry could produce at all. The flow of Dodge ambulances across the Atlantic acknowledged a technological gap that neither nation publicly emphasized, but that operational realities made undeniable. The Austin K2 continued serving honorably through war's end and beyond. Many remained in British service through the 1950s, relegated to garrison duties and rear area transport where their limitations didn't matter. The vehicles had been adequate for their original design requirements. Those requirements had simply been superseded by combat experience that demanded more. The Dodge WC54 became the standard ambulance for Western Allied forces from mid-1944 forward. After victory in Europe, thousands were shipped to the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan. When that invasion became unnecessary, WC54s served occupation duties in Germany and Japan. Many remained in military service through the 1960s. The design was that robust. The lesson extended beyond ambulances to illuminate a broader truth about military technology and national capability. Engineering excellence emerges from competitive pressure and operational necessity. America's civilian automotive industry, competing ruthlessly for market share through the 1930s, had developed engineering sophistication and manufacturing capability that translated directly into military vehicle superiority once war came. Britain's more controlled economy, with less intense civilian competition and more emphasis on traditional military-industrial relationships, had developed capable but less advanced designs. This wasn't a failure of British engineering competence. It was a manifestation of systemic differences in how the two nations' economies operated. When Major Pemberton climbed behind the wheel of that Dodge WC54 on June 14, 1943, he encountered the cumulative result of Detroit's decades-long competition to build better civilian vehicles, a competition that accidentally produced military vehicles British engineers couldn't match. Britain recognized this reality and responded with wisdom that transcended national pride. They adopted the superior technology, saved lives that would have been lost with inferior equipment, and demonstrated that in war, the ultimate loyalty is to effectiveness rather than origin. The Austin K2 was not poorly designed. It was competently designed to meet specifications that combat experience revealed to be inadequate. The Dodge WC54 was not brilliantly designed. It was pragmatically designed to meet more demanding specifications that happened to align better with actual combat conditions. And in that alignment between American automotive capability and European battlefield reality lay the entire story of why British medics ultimately drove American ambulances to collect their wounded. Sometimes the best engineering comes from unexpected places, and sometimes national pride matters less than bringing soldiers home alive.